September 7, 2022, rural Mississippi, approximately 40 miles southeast of Jackson, a location where cotton fields once stretched to the horizon, where an empire had been built on agriculture and ambition, where wealth had flowed and then vanished like morning mist. The Roberts Plantation estate had been abandoned for decades. The main house, a grand two-story wooden structure that had once been the pride of the county, now stood as a monument to decay. White paint, long since faded and peeling, revealed weathered wood beneath. Windows were cracked, shutters hung loose from rusted hinges. The roof sagged dangerously, with missing shingles exposing rotted timbers. The foundation showed eroded brickwork and arched openings that hinted at old storage cellars beneath the structure. Surrounding the main house were the remains of what had once been a thriving agricultural operation. Outbuildings, constructed of wood and now in various states of collapse, dotted the property. What had once been quarters for workers or tool storage now housed only shadows and decay. An abandoned automobile from the 1940s sat rusting in front of the house, its tires long deflated, its body covered in dust and oxidation. Tall grass, uncultivated and wild, had reclaimed the grounds. Dead cotton plants, remnants of crops planted decades ago, mingled with kudzu and other invasive vegetation. This had been the Roberts estate, home to one of Mississippi's wealthiest cotton magnates in the 1920s. A man who had built an empire, who had employed hundreds, whose name had carried weight in business circles from Memphis to New Orleans. A man who had vanished without explanation on an August night in 1922, leaving behind a mystery that would endure for a century. In September 2022, the property had new owners. Heritage South Development, a company specializing in historic property restoration, had purchased the estate at auction. Their plan was ambitious: restore the main house to its former glory, preserve what could be saved of the outbuildings, and transform the property into a historical site and event venue. The Roberts estate, they believed, had heritage value beyond its current state of decay. Before restoration could begin, structural engineers needed to assess the property. On September 7th, a team led by David Anderson, a structural engineer with 30 years of experience in historical buildings, arrived to inspect the foundation and determine what renovation would require. David and his team began their assessment of the main house. The structure was in worse condition than initial surveys had suggested. The foundation, built of brick in the 1890s when the house was originally constructed, showed significant deterioration. But it was the arched openings in the foundation brickwork that caught David's attention. These openings, partially obscured by a century of vegetation growth and accumulated debris, appeared to lead to storage cellars beneath the main house. Such cellars were common in plantation houses of that era, used for storing food, wine, and other goods that benefited from cool, dark conditions. But these particular openings appeared to have been deliberately sealed at some point, filled with bricks and mortar that didn't match the original construction. "Someone blocked these off," David told his assistant, Jennifer Hayes, as they examined the sealed openings. "This isn't original construction. This was done later, maybe in the 20s or 30s, based on the mortar style." They decided to open one of the sealed entrances to inspect the cellar beneath the house. Using careful techniques to avoid damaging the historical structure more than necessary, they removed enough bricks to create an opening large enough to enter. David shone his flashlight into the darkness. The space beyond was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with a ceiling barely 6 feet high. The air that escaped was stale and carried the scent of earth and decay. He could see what appeared to be storage shelves along one wall, rotted and collapsed. And on the floor, partially obscured by fallen debris, was something that made David's blood run cold: skeletal remains. Human skeletal remains, lying in the darkness where they'd been for decades,
perhaps a century. David immediately withdrew and called the authorities. By noon that day, the Rankin County Sheriff's Department had secured the scene. By evening, forensic anthropologists from the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office had arrived. Over the following days, the remains and associated artifacts would be carefully excavated and analyzed. The skeleton was mostly complete. Forensic analysis indicated an adult male, likely in his 40s or 50s at time of death. Fragments of clothing suggested early 20th century men's formal wear. Among the remains were several items that had survived the century. A pocket watch, heavily tarnished but still recognizable, with the initials MHR engraved on the case. A signet ring, gold with a family crest. The remnants of what appeared to be a wallet, the leather almost entirely deteriorated, but containing corroded metal clasps. Historical researchers were brought in. The initials MHR and the location led them to examine records from the Roberts family in the early 20th century. They found something remarkable, a missing persons case from 1922 involving Michael Harrison Roberts, the plantation's owner, who had vanished on August 12th of that year and never been found. Dental records from that era were rare, but the Roberts family had been wealthy enough to have had dental work at the time.
Documented. Historical dental records were located in the archives of a Jackson dentist's office that had served the Roberts family. Comparison with the skeletal remains provided a probable match, though after 100 years, absolute certainty was impossible through dental records alone. Additional evidence came from genealogical research. Living descendants of the Roberts family were located. DNA analysis comparing the skeletal remains to genetic material from known descendants provided a definitive identification. The remains were those of Michael Harrison Roberts, missing for exactly 100 years. Before we continue with this mystery, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happened on August 12, 1922 involves wealth, power, and a disappearance that shocked Mississippi society. By the end, you'll understand how one of the state's most prominent businessmen ended up dead in a sealed cellar beneath his own home and why it took a century to find him. The questions investigators faced were haunting. Who killed Michael Harrison Roberts? Why was he hidden in his own estate? And how did a murder in a house full of people go undetected for 100 years? Michael Harrison Roberts was 45 years old in 1922. At the peak of his wealth and influence, he stood 6 feet tall with a solid build that came from years of physical work in his youth before wealth allowed him to delegate such labor. His hair, dark brown in his younger years, had begun to gray at the temples by his mid-40s. He wore a meticulously groomed mustache in the style popular among businessmen of the era. His eyes were gray-blue, and those who knew him described them as calculating, the eyes of a man who carefully assessed every situation for advantage. Michael had been born in 1877 in northern Mississippi, the son of a small farmer who owned 40 acres and struggled to make ends meet. The Civil War had ended only 12 years before Michael's birth, and the South was still recovering economically. Michael grew up understanding that poverty was one bad harvest away, that security required not just hard work, but also shrewd planning and a willingness to take calculated risks. He'd received a basic education at a local school, learning reading, writing, and arithmetic, but his real education came from watching his father try and fail to make farming profitable. Michael understood from a young age that owning land wasn't enough. You needed scale, efficiency, access to markets, and capital to invest when opportunities arose. At age 18, Michael left home with $20 saved and a determination to build something larger than his father's 40 acres. He worked as a farmhand, then as an overseer for a larger plantation, learning every aspect of cotton cultivation and the business of agriculture.
He saved every penny he could, invested carefully, and by age 25 had purchased his first property, 80 acres of good cotton land near what would become the Roberts estate. From that 80 acres, Michael built an empire. He expanded methodically, purchasing adjacent properties when owners faced financial trouble, acquiring land from families unable to pay taxes during economic downturns. By 1900, at age 23, he owned 5,000 acres. By 1910, 2,000 acres. By 1920, the Roberts Plantation encompassed over 5,000 acres, making him one of the largest landowners in the county. Cotton was the foundation of his wealth. Mississippi in the early 20th century was cotton country, and Michael Roberts understood the business better than most. He invested in modern equipment, implemented efficient farming methods, and developed relationships with cotton buyers in Memphis and New Orleans that ensured he received fair prices for his crops. When other farmers struggled during market downturns, Michael had the capital reserves to weather the storms and often emerged stronger by purchasing their land. But Michael wasn't simply a farmer on a large scale. He was a businessman who understood diversification. He owned a cotton gin that processed not only his crops, but those of smaller farmers for a fee. He owned shares in a railway company that transported cotton to market. He invested in a bank in Jackson. He owned rental properties in 3 counties. By 1922, his wealth was estimated at over $2 million, equivalent to approximately $30 million in modern currency. Michael had married in 1900 at age 23. His wife, Elizabeth Chambers, was the daughter of a prominent Jackson attorney. Their marriage was advantageous for both families. Michael gained social respectability and connections to Mississippi's professional class, while Elizabeth's family gained ties to agricultural wealth. By all accounts, their marriage was cordial, if not particularly passionate. They had 2 children, a son, Harrison, born in 1901, and a daughter, Margaret, born in 1904. By 1922, both children were adults. Harrison, aged 21, worked in the family business, being groomed to eventually take over management of the plantation. Margaret, age 18, lived at home and was being prepared for marriage to a suitable match from another prominent Mississippi family. The Roberts family lived in the main plantation house, the grand 2-story structure that now stood abandoned and decaying a century later. In 1922, that house was magnificent. Servants maintained it meticulously. The finest furniture filled its rooms. The family entertained regularly, hosting dinners for business associates and social gatherings for the county's elite. Michael Roberts was known in business circles as shrewd, occasionally ruthless, but generally honest. He drove hard bargains, but honored his commitments. He expected efficiency from those who worked for him and had little patience for excuses or failure. People respected him more than they liked him, but respect translated to influence, and Michael had considerable influence in Mississippi business and political circles. But wealth and power create enemies as well as opportunities. Michael's rise had come partly at the expense of others. Farmers he'd purchased land from during hard times sometimes felt he'd taken advantage. Competitors in the cotton business resented his success. Labor organizers viewed him as an oppressor. By 1922, Michael Harrison Roberts had built an empire, but empires are rarely built without creating resentments. The weekend of August 12th through 13th, 1922, Michael had planned a business gathering at the Roberts estate. He'd invited several business associates from Jackson and Memphis to discuss potential investments in agricultural equipment manufacturing. Cotton farming was becoming increasingly mechanized, and Michael saw opportunity in owning part of the manufacturing supply chain rather than just purchasing equipment. Saturday, August 12th, dawned hot and humid, typical for Mississippi in August. Michael spent the morning reviewing financial documents in his study. That afternoon, his guests began arriving. By evening, approximately 20 people were present. Business associates, their wives, Michael's own family, and several local prominent citizens who had been invited to make the gathering more social than purely business. Dinner was served at 7 p.m. in the Plantation House dining room. Michael presided over the meal, discussing business opportunities, telling stories, playing the role of gracious host.
After dinner, the men retired to Michael's study to smoke cigars and discuss the proposed investments in more detail. The women remained in the parlor, socializing according to the customs of the era. Around 10 p.m., according to later testimony from those present, Michael excused himself from the study. He told his guests he needed to retrieve some documents from another part of the house, financial projections he wanted them to review. He left the study and walked into the main hall of the house. That was the last time anyone admitted to seeing Michael Harrison Roberts alive. When 20 minutes passed and he hadn't returned, his son Harrison went looking for him. The documents Michael had mentioned weren't in the locations Harrison checked. Michael wasn't in his bedroom, the library, the dining room, or any of the obvious locations. By 11 p.m., when Michael still hadn't reappeared, concern turned to alarm. The guests, the family, and the household staff conducted a search of the entire house and the immediate grounds. They found nothing. Michael's automobile was still in its garage. His personal items, his wallet and keys, were in his bedroom. He hadn't taken anything with him. He'd simply vanished from his own home in the middle of a gathering, surrounded by family and guests. By midnight, someone had contacted the local sheriff. By morning, a full investigation was underway. But despite extensive searches, despite interviews with everyone present, despite examination of the property and surrounding areas, Michael Harrison Roberts was never found. Not alive, not dead, just gone, as if he'd stepped out of reality itself. And beneath the very house where his guests had gathered, where his family searched in confusion and growing fear, Michael's body lay in a sealed cellar, hidden in darkness, waiting 100 years to be discovered. August 12, 1922, a Saturday evening at the Roberts Plantation estate, the kind of evening where business and social obligations intertwined, where deals were discussed over cigars and whiskey, where the machinery of early 20th century Mississippi commerce moved forward in parlors and studies rather than offices. The guest list for that evening included some of the most prominent businessmen in Mississippi. From Memphis came Thomas Sullivan, who owned a company manufacturing agricultural equipment. From Jackson came Robert Davis, a banker with whom Michael had done business for years. Also present were Daniel Martinez, who operated cotton gins in 3 counties, William Anderson, who owned railway stock, and James Clark, who'd recently invested in automotive sales as cars began replacing horses. Each man had brought his wife, and the Roberts family had invited several local prominent families to make the gathering more balanced socially. In total, approximately 20 people were present that evening, including the Roberts family themselves: Michael, his wife Elizabeth, his son Harrison, and his daughter Margaret. The evening followed the patterns typical of such gatherings in that era. Guests arrived between 5 and 6 p.m. They were offered refreshments, engaged in polite conversation, admired the plantation house and grounds. At 7 p.m., dinner was served in the formal dining room. The meal was elaborate, prepared by the Roberts family's cook with assistance from household staff. Multiple courses, fine wines from Michael's cellar, conversation that ranged from weather to politics to business prospects. After dinner, around 8:30 p.m., the gathering divided along gender lines, as was customary in that era. The women retired to the parlor, where they would socialize, perhaps play piano, discuss families and social matters. The men moved to Michael's study, a wood-paneled room on the first floor where Michael conducted much of his business. The dream study was where the real purpose of the evening would unfold. Michael wanted to discuss an investment opportunity with his guests, a partnership to establish a manufacturing facility for agricultural equipment. Cotton farming was becoming increasingly mechanized, and Michael saw opportunity in owning part of the manufacturing supply chain rather than just purchasing equipment.
Also serving Southern agricultural interests. The discussion in the study was animated but cordial. Thomas Sullivan, who already manufactured such equipment in Memphis, explained production costs and market demand. Robert Davis discussed financing structures. Daniel Martinez talked about what equipment farmers most needed. Michael Roberts outlined his vision: a facility in Mississippi, closer to the farms that would use the equipment, reducing transportation costs while creating local employment. Around 9:30 p.m., Michael called for whiskey to be brought from the house's supplies. One of the household staff, a man named Samuel Thompson, who'd worked for the Roberts family for 10 years, later testified that he'd brought the whiskey to the study at Michael's request. He'd seen all the men present engaged in conversation, smoking cigars. Nothing had seemed unusual. At approximately 10 p.m., according to multiple witnesses, Michael announced he needed to retrieve some financial documents. He'd mentioned these projections earlier in the evening, figures showing the potential profitability of the manufacturing venture. He said they were in a safe in another part of the house, that he'd return in a few minutes. Michael left the study. Several of the men present later testified to watching him leave through the study door, turning left into the main hallway that ran the length of the first floor. The hallway led past the dining room, the parlor where the women were gathered, and toward the back of the house, where additional rooms included a library, a secondary office, and storage areas. What happened next remains unclear even after 100 years. What's certain is that Michael Roberts never returned to the study. The projections he'd mentioned were never located, and somewhere between leaving that study and whatever destination he'd intended, Michael disappeared. At first, the men in the study weren't concerned. Business discussions continued. They assumed Michael had been delayed retrieving the documents or had perhaps stopped to speak with his wife or attend to some household matter. But when 15 minutes passed, then 20, conversation began to falter. Where was their host? At approximately 10:25 p.m., Michael's son, Harrison, decided to check on his father. He left the study and walked through the house, following the route his father would have taken. He checked the library, empty. The secondary office, no one there. He went upstairs, checked his parents' bedroom. His mother's belongings were there, but no sign of his father. He returned downstairs and checked the dining room, the kitchen area, the pantries. Harrison returned to the study at approximately 10:35 p.m. and informed the guests that he couldn't locate his father. At this point, concern became alarm. The entire gathering, men and women both, began searching the house systematically. They checked every room on both floors. They opened closets, looked in storage areas, checked the bathrooms. Nothing. By 11 p.m., the search had uneased expanded outside. With lanterns and flashlights, the guests and household staff searched the immediate grounds. The stable where horses were kept, no one there. The garage where Michael's automobile was stored. The car was present, but Michael was not. The various outbuildings and storage sheds dotting the property, all empty. At some point during this search, someone discovered that Michael's personal effects were still in his bedroom, his wallet containing cash and identification documents, his keys, his pocket watch, which he typically carried. This discovery was troubling. If Michael had left the property, why would he leave without these items? And if he hadn't left, where was he? At approximately midnight, Elizabeth Roberts, Michael's wife, insisted that the sheriff be contacted. One of the guests drove into town to fetch Sheriff James Wilson, who arrived at the Roberts estate around 1 a.m. on Sunday, August 13th. Sheriff Wilson was a competent lawman who'd served the E.E. County for 15 years. He immediately grasped the strangeness of the situation. A prominent businessman had vanished from his own home during a social gathering. No one had seen him leave the property. His personal effects and vehicle remained. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of any disturbance. Wilson organized a more thorough search. As Sunday morning dawned, dozens of people combed the plantation property. Every building, every structure, every field within a mile radius of the main house was examined. Nothing. Wilson interviewed everyone who had been present the previous evening. Their stories were consistent. Michael had left the study around 10 p.m. to retrieve documents. No one had seen him after that. No one had heard anything unusual. No shouts, no sounds of struggle, no indication of any disturbance. Wilson also interviewed the household staff. In 1922, the Roberts household employed several people: a cook, a housekeeper, a groundskeeper, a driver, and several others who performed various duties. All of them were questioned. All claimed to know nothing about Michael's disappearance.
The investigation expanded over the following weeks and months. State police were brought in. Private investigators were hired by the family. Every aspect of Michael's life was examined for any clue to what might have happened. The investigation into Michael Harrison Roberts' disappearance quickly became one of the most puzzling cases in Mississippi history. Sheriff Wilson worked with state investigators to explore every possibility. One early theory was that Michael had voluntarily disappeared. Investigators examined his financial records, looking for evidence of trouble that might cause him to flee. What they found was the opposite. Michael's
Finances were in excellent order. His plantation was profitable. His investments were sound. He had no significant debts. There was no financial reason for him to disappear. Investigators also looked into Michael's personal life. Were there romantic entanglements, problems in his marriage? Evidence suggested Michael's marriage to Elizabeth was stable, if not passionate. There were no indications of affairs or scandals. His children seemed to have normal relationships with him. His personal life appeared unremarkable. Could Michael have been the victim of foul play? This seemed most likely given the circumstances. But who and why? Investigators identified several categories of potential suspects: business rivals who might resent Michael's success. Cotton farming was competitive, and Michael had built his empire partly by taking advantage of others' failures. Several farmers who'd lost land to Michael were identified and questioned. All had alibis for the evening of August 12th. None seemed to have the resources or opportunity to make a man vanish from his own home during a social gathering. Labor activists who might view Michael as an oppressor. The early 1920s saw labor unrest across America, and plantation owners were sometimes targets. But investigators found no evidence of labor organization activity around the Roberts estate in August 1922. No threats had been made against Michael. Someone present at the gathering itself. This was perhaps the most troubling possibility. If Michael had been killed, it almost certainly happened in or near the house. The most likely perpetrators would be someone who was present that evening, who had access to the house, who had opportunity. But who and why? Investigators carefully examined the backgrounds and potential motives of everyone present on August 12th. The Roberts estate all seemed to have had positive relationships with Michael. The proposed manufacturing venture would benefit them all. None appeared to have any reason to harm him. The household staff were scrutinized closely. In 1922 Mississippi, questions of class and race complicated such investigations. Several of the staff members were black, employed in positions common for that era. Investigators' racial prejudices meant these staff members faced more suspicion and harsher questioning than perhaps they should have, though no evidence ever emerged implicating any of them. Michael's own family came under investigation. In any disappearance or murder, those closest to the victim are always suspects. But what would their motive be? Michael's son, Harrison, was being groomed to take over the business. His father's continued success was in Harrison's interest. Michael's wife, Elizabeth, would lose financial security if anything happened to Michael. His daughter, Margaret, had no apparent motive. Nevertheless, investigators examined their movements and statements carefully. The Roberts estate was searched multiple times. Every building, every structure, every potential hiding place was examined. But the search had limitations. The property was vast, over 5,000 acres. Investigators focused on the main house in immediate vicinity, assuming that if Michael had been killed, his body would be relatively close to where he was last seen. What investigators didn't do was thoroughly examine the cellar spaces beneath the main house. They looked into the obvious cellar entrance, a stairway leading down from the kitchen area to a storage cellar that held preserved foods and wine. That cellar was checked and found to contain nothing unusual. But there were other cellar spaces, smaller storage areas accessible only through the arched openings in the foundation. Spaces that had been deliberately sealed with brick and mortar at some point, possibly before August 1922, possibly shortly after. Why weren't these sealed spaces investigated? Partly because they weren't obvious. The sealed openings were obscured by vegetation and accumulated debris. They looked like part of the original foundation structure. There was no reason to suspect they led anywhere significant. And in 1922, investigation techniques were less sophisticated than modern methods. Ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and forensic technology that might have detected a body hidden in a sealed space simply didn't exist. As weeks became months, the investigation stalled.
Michael Harrison Roberts had simply vanished. Every lead had been followed, every theory investigated. Nothing explained where he'd gone or what had happened to him. In 1923, 1 year after his disappearance, the Roberts family petitioned to have Michael declared legally dead. This was necessary to settle his estate and allow the family to move forward. In 1925, the court granted this request. Michael Harrison Roberts was declared legally deceased, though no body had been found, no cause of death established, no explanation provided. The Roberts plantation continued operating under Elizabeth's management, with their son Harrison running day-to-day operations. But the plantation's glory days were ending. The agricultural depression of the 1920s hit Mississippi hard. Cotton prices fell. The mechanization that Michael had wanted to invest in was making smaller plantations obsolete. Competition from other regions increased. Without Michael's business acumen and connections, the Roberts operation struggled. Elizabeth Roberts died in 1935 at age 58. Harrison managed the plantation until 1948, when he sold most of the land to pay debts. The main house and immediate grounds, about 100 acres, remained in the Roberts family.
Family hands, but were increasingly neglected. Margaret, Michael's daughter, had married and moved away in the 1930s. She had no interest in the property. By the 1960s, the Roberts estate was effectively abandoned. The last family member with any connection to it had died, and the property passed through several owners who had no emotional attachment to its history. The house, no longer maintained, began its slow decay. The outbuildings collapsed. The fields returned to wilderness. The mystery of Michael Harrison Roberts' disappearance became local legend. Stories circulated. Theories multiplied. Some believed he'd been murdered. Others thought he'd run away. A few claimed he'd been abducted. But with no evidence, no body, no resolution, the truth remained hidden. And beneath the decaying plantation house, in a sealed cellar that no one had thought to investigate thoroughly, Michael Harrison Roberts' remains lay in darkness, waiting for 100 years to tell their story. The century between Michael Harrison Roberts' disappearance in 1922 and the discovery of his remains in 2022 saw dramatic changes in Mississippi, America, and the world. The Roaring Twenties became the Great Depression. World War II reshaped global politics. The Civil Rights Movement transformed the South. Technology advanced from radio to television to the internet. The world Michael had known became a historical curiosity. But the Roberts plantation estate, increasingly forgotten and abandoned, became a kind of time capsule. As the main house decayed, it preserved beneath its floorboards a secret that no one living remembered. The property changed hands multiple times over the decades. In the 1960s, a developer purchased it, thinking to subdivide the land for residential construction. That plan failed when economic conditions made development unprofitable. In the 1980s, the property was bought by someone who planned to restore the main house. That restoration never materialized due to lack of funding. The property was sold again in the 2000s to an investor who held it for years doing nothing, eventually losing it to tax foreclosure. Throughout these decades, the mystery of Michael Roberts occasionally resurfaced in local historical interest. In the 1950s and 70s, a local historian wrote an article about prominent Mississippi families and included a section on the Roberts disappearance. The article recounted the known facts, noted the various theories, and concluded that the truth would likely never be known. In the 1990s, a true crime writer researching unsolved Mississippi included a chapter on Michael Roberts. The writer interviewed descendants of people who'd been present at the August 1922 gathering, though by then all direct witnesses were long deceased. The chapter presented the disappearance as an enduring puzzle. A wealthy man vanishes from his own home, surrounded by guests, and is never found. Theories ranged from murder to voluntary disappearance to kidnapping, but no evidence supported any theory conclusively. The Roberts estate itself became known locally as haunted. Teenagers would occasionally dare each other to visit the abandoned plantation house at night. Stories circulated of strange sounds, ghostly figures, inexplicable occurrences. These were likely imagination fueled by the property's eerie atmosphere, but the stories persisted. The abandoned house with its sagging roof and broken windows certainly looked the part of a haunted mansion. By 2020, the estate had been condemned by county authorities. The main house was structurally unsound, dangerous to enter. Several of the outbuildings had completely collapsed. The property was considered a liability, an eyesore, something that needed to be either restored or demolished. In June 2022, Heritage South Development purchased the property at auction for approximately $300,000. The company specialized in historical restoration, transforming abandoned historical properties into event venues, museums, or boutique hotels. They saw potential in the Roberts estate, despite its condition. Kyle Martinez, Heritage South's president, explained their vision in later interviews. The Roberts Plantation represented an important part of Mississippi history. Yes, it was associated with the plantation system, and that has complicated legacy. But preserving these properties lets us tell the full story of our past, both the achievements and the injustices. We planned to restore the main house, create historical exhibits about plantation life from multiple perspectives, and create a venue that could generate revenue while preserving history. Heritage South began planning the restoration in summer 2022. They hired David Anderson, a structural engineer, to assess the property and determine what restoration would require. David's initial assessment in August 2022 confirmed the main house was in poor condition but likely salvageable with significant work. The foundation was his main concern. David returned to the property in early September 2022 with a more detailed inspection plan. On September 7th, he and his team began examining the foundation closely. That's when they noticed the sealed openings in the brickwork. The arched openings in the Roberts Plantation foundation had been obscured for decades by vegetation, accumulated debris, and a century of neglect. They appeared at first glance to be simply part of the foundation's architectural detail, decorative arches that gave the base of the structure visual interest. But David Anderson, with decades of experience examining historical buildings, recognized that the brickwork in these arched areas didn't match the rest of the foundation. The mortar was different, slightly newer, applied less skillfully than the original construction. Someone had filled in openings that once existed. These led somewhere, David explained to his assistant, Jennifer Hayes, who was documenting the inspection, probably to storage cellars. That was common in houses of this era. Multiple cellar spaces accessed from different points used for different purposes. Someone sealed these off at some point. Standard procedure would be to document the sealed openings and move on, but David's curiosity and professional thoroughness led him to suggest opening one to examine the space beyond. Heritage South wanted to know everything about the property's structure before beginning restoration. If there were hidden cellars, they needed to be assessed for structural integrity and potential issues like water damage or foundation problems. On September 7, 2022, David and his team carefully removed enough bricks from one of the sealed openings to create access. The work was slow and careful, preserving as much of the historical masonry as possible. By late morning, they'd created an opening approximately 3 feet wide and 4 feet high. David shone a high-powered flashlight into the darkness beyond. The beam revealed a small space, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with a low ceiling, maybe 6 feet high. The cellar appeared to have been carved out of the earth beneath the house with brick walls and floor. Along one wall were the remains of wooden shelving, rotted and collapsed. The floor was covered in debris, fallen brick, deteriorated wood, and what appeared to be fabric fragments. And then David's light caught something that made him freeze. Among the debris on the cellar floor, partially obscured by fallen material, was a human skull. David immediately withdrew from the opening and called the authorities. By noon, the Rankin County Sheriff's Department had arrived. By afternoon, forensic specialists from the Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office were on scene. The property was secured, and a careful excavation of the hidden cellar began. Over the following 3 days, forensic anthropologists worked in the cramped cellar space, carefully removing debris and excavating the skeletal remains. The work was meticulous, as every bone fragment, every artifact, every detail could potentially provide information about the victim's identity and how they died. The remains were substantially complete, a full skeleton lying on what would have been the cellar floor, though now buried under accumulated debris. The body appeared to have been placed in the cellar shortly after death, rather than dying there, based on the position and lack of signs of struggle against the cellar walls. The preservation after 100 years was poor, but not as bad as might be expected. The sealed cellar had protected the remains from scavengers and weather. The cool, dark environment had slowed some decomposition processes. The skeleton itself was largely intact, though small bones from the hands and feet were scattered or missing. Clothing had almost entirely disintegrated, only fragments remained. Pieces of what appeared to be a suit jacket, recognizable by buttons and the remnants of a zipper that was advanced technology in the 1920s. Fragments of a shirt so deteriorated it was barely identifiable. Pieces of leather that might have been shoes or a belt. But several items had survived in better condition due to their materials. A pocket watch, gold-plated, heavily tarnished but intact. When carefully cleaned, engraving on the case became visible. The initials MHR. A signet ring, also gold, still on one of the finger bones. The ring bore a family crest, the design still distinguishable despite a century of oxidation. The deteriorated remains of a wallet, the leather almost completely decayed, but containing metal clasps and what appeared to be corroded coins. Forensic analysis of the skeletal remains provided additional information. The individual was male, approximately 45 to 50 years old at time of death, based on bone development and wear patterns. Height estimated at approximately 6 feet. The skull showed evidence of significant trauma, a fracture on the left side consistent with a heavy blow from a blunt object. This trauma would have been fatal or near fatal. There were no other injuries, suggesting death came from this single blow, but identification needed more than physical characteristics. The pocket watch initials and signet ring suggested an identity, but confirmation required more. Historical research began immediately. The MHR initials found at the Roberts Plantation estate led investigators to examine records of the Roberts family. They found the file on Michael Harrison Roberts, reported missing in August 1922, never found. The description of Michael from those records matched the forensic analysis. Male, mid-40s, 6 feet tall. The initials matched. The signet ring's family crest was photographed and compared to Roberts' family records. A match. But after 100 years, could identification be certain? Genealogical researchers located descendants of Michael Harrison Roberts. His daughter, Margaret, had married and had children. That line continued, and several great-great-grandchildren were alive in 2022. These descendants were contacted and agreed to provide DNA samples. Comparison of genetic material from the skeletal remains to DNA from known descendants provided definitive confirmation. The statistical probability of a match to someone not in the Roberts family line was infinitesimally small. The identification was certain. These were the remains of Michael Harrison Roberts, missing since August 12, 1922, found 100 years later in a sealed cellar beneath his own house. The discovery of Michael Harrison Roberts' remains 100 years after his disappearance answered one question: where was he? But raised many others. Who killed him? Why? And how did a murder in a house full of people go undetected? After 100 years, forensic evidence can only reveal so much. The skeletal remains showed how Michael died, a fatal blow to the head with a blunt object. The location of the remains showed where his body had been hidden, but identifying the killer with certainty was impossible a century after the crime. Investigators and historical historians examined the evidence and historical records to construct the most probable explanation. What follows is theory based on available evidence, not proven fact. Michael Harrison Roberts was killed on the evening of August 12, 1922, almost certainly by someone present at the gathering that night.
The sealed cellar where his body was found wasn't accessible by chance. Someone knew about that space and chose to use it to hide a body. The sealing of the cellar entrance, which forensic examination of the brickwork suggested happened around 1922, was done to conceal the crime. Who had the knowledge, opportunity, and motive? After 100 years, this remains speculation, but several possibilities emerged. Someone in Michael's household staff? These individuals knew the plantation property intimately, including spaces like the hidden cellar that visitors wouldn't know about. They would have had access to tools and materials to seal the cellar entrance. But what would their motive be? Treatment by employers, resentments built over years, or perhaps something specific that sparked violence on that particular evening? Without testimony from people long dead, these motives remain unknown. Someone in Michael's family? This was the most troubling possibility, but couldn't be dismissed. Michael's son, Harrison, was present that evening and stood to inherit when his father died. Though, by all accounts, their relationship was good, and Harrison was already being groomed for leadership. Michael's wife, Elizabeth, would gain control of the estate, though she'd lose her business acumen that kept the operation profitable. His daughter, Margaret, had no obvious motive, but family members would have known the property well, including hidden spaces. One of the business associates present? Perhaps the proposed manufacturing venture had hidden complications. Perhaps someone stood to benefit from Michael's death in ways not apparent a century later. Business motives for murder are common, though usually involve financial gain that investigators couldn't identify in this case. The most likely theory, based on the evidence and historical context, is this: Michael was killed by someone who had access to the house and detailed knowledge of the property. The murder was probably not premeditated, but rather arose from an argument or confrontation that escalated to violence. The killer, panicking, realized they needed to hide the body and remembered the hidden cellar space. They placed Michael's body there, then sealed the entrance to prevent discovery. The killer's biggest advantage was timing. The cellar space wasn't obvious to searchers. In the confusion of the evening and the chaos of searching a large property, the sealed cellar opening went unnoticed, and once days passed, then weeks, then months, any physical evidence at the crime scene deteriorated. The killer, if they survived the following years, likely took their secret to the grave decades ago. Could the case be solved with certainty today? Almost certainly not. Everyone present on August 12, 1922 is long dead. Physical evidence after 100 years is minimal. The historical records provide facts, but not conclusions. Michael Harrison Roberts' murder will likely remain officially unsolved. A century-old crime with too many possibilities and too little definitive evidence to point to a specific perpetrator. The discovery of Michael Harrison Roberts' remains 100 years after his disappearance brought closure of a sort to his descendants. Great-great-grandchildren who'd grown up hearing family stories about the ancestor who mysteriously disappeared now knew what happened to him, at least in general terms. In October 2022, Michael Harrison Roberts was finally laid to rest in a Jackson cemetery, his remains buried with a new gravestone that acknowledged both his life and the mystery of his death. Michael Harrison Roberts,